One of the key players in House of the Dragon Season 1 was Corlys Velaryon's firstborn son, Laenor. Laenor had been involved in the Dance of the Dragons from birth, for he was the son of one of the claimants to the Iron Throne, Princess Rhaenys Targaryen. He grew up to realize his mother's dream when he was betrothed to Rhaenyra, and proved his worth to his father when he rode Seasmoke into battle at the Stepstones. Laenor was one of the only characters you could out and out like, and you wouldn't be judged for it, until he was no longer involved in the succession struggle. Officially, he's dead and cremated, but there's a possibility that he might return from beyond the grave this season, and it's all thanks to his dragon. Let's dive into the question many of us have had on our minds since Daemon said that Seasmoke still roosts within the Dragonmont. Is Laenor Velaryon coming back for the dance? Before we go into our explanation, we have a very small request. If you like our content, please support us by subscribing to our channel. This is a small click for you, but for us it means a lot. Thank you. Let's begin. What happened to Laenor Velaryon in Season 1? How is his fate different from the books? Sir Laenor was portrayed as a sort of goofy but well-meaning noble in Season 1. He was goofy in that he asked Rhaenyra how painful her childbirth was when she was clearly struggling to even walk, but he was well-meaning in that he offered her his hand and did his husbandly duties to her in the best of his ability. Laenor was a proven mariner and warrior, the perfect scion of the ancient House Velaryon, a dragon rider who brought into his family something they'd never had. Despite being Velaryons, his only crime was being gay. Laenor's sexual orientation is something that put his political status at odds with his personal life constantly, for he wanted to be open about things, but he couldn't, because of who he was. Corlys turned a blind eye to his son's true nature as long as he did his duty to his house, but as great of a man the Sea Snake was, he could never read his family closely enough. If he'd spent some time looking at Laenor without his ambition-tinted glasses, he'd have seen the truth that the rest of the world saw plain as day, that his son was in fact gay. Laenor had many male companions in life, and Jace, Luke, and Joff were clearly not his children. He was married to Rhaenyra for 10 years, but his lovers were Sir Joffrey of Lonmouth and Sir Carl Corey. He loved those kids all the same, but he was never a true father to them. That responsibility fell to Sir Harwin Strong, and later Daemon, though we think the latter is worse than Laenor at being a parent. In House of the Dragon, Laenor finally gets the chance to live the life he always wanted, but he isn't so lucky in the source material. In Fire and Blood, Laenor dies due to a disagreement with his second lover Carl. In the year 120 AC, he visits a fair in Spicetown with Carl, where traders and merchants report that the pair started arguing, which eventually led to the drawing of swords. Carl ends up killing Laenor, whose body is claimed by Corlys and then taken to Driftmark. The Sea Snake puts a massive 10,000 golden dragon bounty on Carl's head, but no one ever finds the man. And it's at Laenor's funeral that Aemon claims Vhagar, not Laena's. The prince consort's death takes place in a public setting in Fire and Blood, so there's no room for faking things. Daemon is implied to be involved, considering he quickly marries Rhaenyra in the aftermath, but Laenor's death was a canon event. House of the Dragon switched things up majorly by turning the whole Carl Corey being employed by Daemon theory into an escape subplot for Laenor. In episode 7 of Season 1, Daemon does hire Carl to kill someone with many witnesses, but it turns out the killing itself is staged. Carl attacks Laenor in Castle Driftmark long enough for a servant to witness their fight and go running for Lord Corlys. Once he's gone, the conspirators put the body of a guard Daemon had killed in the hearth of the Great Hall and vanish into the night air. People point fingers toward both Rhaenyra and Daemon. Rhaenys breaks down in grief, and Corlys can't believe such a thing could happen in his own home. But at the end of the episode, we see Laenor with his head shaved, leaving Driftmark in a rowboat with Carl. Upon his sister Laena's death, Laenor tried to renew his pledge of loyalty to Rhaenyra, but she knew he was struggling, and all he really wanted to do was return to fighting and adventure in the Stepstones. She also needed to strengthen her own claim, now that Alicent's children had Vhagar, so she decides to kill two birds with one stone. By facilitating Laenor's disappearance, she opens herself up to another marriage, which she acts upon immediately by wedding Daemon at Dragonstone. Laenor himself gets to live the life he always wanted, free of his duties with the man he loves. While this is a very touching note for the character's arc to end on, it does create some major issues for a future plotline of House of the Dragon: the sowing of the dragon seeds. Why is Laenor being alive a problem for the sowing? How the dragon bond works. In the final episode of Season 1, we see Daemon taking stock of all the dragons that the Blacks have, and can potentially have. He brings up Meleys, Caraxes, Syrax, and Vermax, all of whom are of fighting size. Baela's Moondancer is large enough to fight in the show as well, whereas Luke's Arax was too small to be combat ready, and Joff's Tyraxes is presumably even smaller, but both can at least fly, and Arax, well, he tried his best to fight, didn't he? Rest in peace to the little guy. Still, before Erac's death, the Blacks had 6 dragons with bonded riders, and there were even more dragons in the Dragonmont that were waiting for a new rider to claim them. One of them, Vermithor, Daemon sang to personally. The others are Silverwing, Grey Ghost, Sheepstealer, the Cannibal, and Seasmoke, who's confusingly enough still hovering around Driftmark. Daemon is right in assuming that if they find riders for all these riderless dragons, then they could take King's Landing and defeat the Greens in less than a month, because even Vhagar isn't mighty enough to hold off 13 dragons. But the big question for us is how the hell he expects to get one of those 13 to bond with another person, when technically speaking, his previous rider is still alive. The dragon bond is a highly spiritual and esoteric concept in J.R.R. Martin's world. It's said that Velaryons tamed the dragons with blood and magic, and that the wilder the dragon got, the harder taming them became. Those dragons who have experienced human contact were still relatively docile in their presence, but wild dragons were especially fearsome, and so were dragons who already had riders, but they were being approached with claiming intent by someone else. We saw evidence to this effect in the series. Before claiming Vhagar, Aemon Targaryen went to the dragon pit and tried to claim his sister's dragon. In episode 6 of season 1, we learned that he's tried many times to bond with Dreamfire, despite knowing it was his sister's dragon. Helena bonded with the legacy of Queen Rhaenyra Targaryen early on, and we're guessing that her being a dreamer makes her bond stronger than usual. But the way Dreamfire rejects Aemon's approach, it's both familiar and yet cautionary. She knows she must direct her flames upward, and yet she's angered nonetheless that he's returned looking to claim her once again, when he clearly knows he cannot. There's another moment from the books that clearly establishes the dragon bond is a one-to-one thing, cemented for the lifetime of the writer. We're going to tiptoe around a major spoiler for House of the Dragon now, so do continue from this point onward with extreme caution. But in Fire and Blood, another Targaryen prince tries to claim a dragon that's already bonded, or rather, he tries to ride one with a long-established rider. This prince is directly related to the previous, rather in that said rider was his parent. And yet, once he mounts the bonded dragon, it senses that he isn't its original rider, and then throws him to his death once it's high enough. King Viserys' warning about dragons being the ones in control of their riders will be proven correct when the scene plays out in front of our eyes. But the more important thing to take away here is that the fact that the dragon decided to throw off the prince willingly. His death was not a mishap. This means that as long as Sir Laenor is alive, Seasmoke should be bonded to him and shouldn't really let any other person near it. And you can understand how that would be a problem if it were to be involved in the sowing, can't you? If Seasmoke is still bonded to Laenor, it simply won't accept a new rider, and will cause a massacre at the sowing if someone tries to claim him. None of the dragon seeds will have any benefit of being Laenor's direct descendants either, for reasons that should be obvious. It's this fact that brings us to the big question of the day. Is Laenor going to return to the series, and what will happen to Seasmoke? The only way to bring Seasmoke into the dance peacefully is with Laenor's return, because that's just how the dragon bond works. So as long as a rider and his dragon are connected, that connection lasts for the former's lifetime, because dragons can easily outlive their riders. But that brings us to our next question. How will Laenor Velaryon return to the show in a way that explains his 6-year-long absence? Remember that the only reason his death was fake was so that he could live a life free of the pressures of being a gay nobleman. Laenor loved his family, and sailing under the Velaryon banner gave him some of the best days. But at the same time, the stigma that came with him being prince consort was so overwhelming for him that he allowed his mother to think he was dead and grieve him. Laenor was always on about the War of the Stepstones, and how he wished to return to it to feel useful. But the thing is, if he'd gone back after faking his death, he'd surely have been discovered. Shortly after Laena's death, the Sea Snake too heads for the Stepstones, and he stays there until Viserys draws closer, 6 years later. The Stepstones are big, but they aren't so massive a region that Corlys wouldn't be able to see most of his crewmen in the 6 years he spent with them. Moreover, many in the Velaryon fleet would be familiar with Laenor's face, even after he cut off his Velaryon hair. It's more likely that he went further down Essos way with Carl Corey, likely joining up with a mercenary company instead. So that explains how Laenor didn't come across his dad after his death. But is it possible that he's still alive? We very much doubt it. The only known way to sever a dragon bond is the rider's death. You could say that one can probably nullify the bond using some sort of blood magic, but no character we've seen in the series so far is familiar enough with Velaryon secrets to pull off a feat like that. Daemon is probably the only one close to that, but he'll be far away from Dragonstone when the sowing occurs. And more than that, we doubt he'll be interested in doing such a thing. So how will Seasmoke come into play in the dance? Well, there's really only one way it can happen, and that's if Laenor dies. His death can occur off screen. It would be poetic, similar to Alyssa Farman's story, which was allegedly never resolved. Or they could bring in John Macmillan for a short death sequence where they show us how Laenor dies. Considering his nature, he likely joined one of the mercenary companies of the Free Cities with Carl, and spent the rest of his days fighting. A secret prince dying a nameless death in some corner of the disputed lands. That sounds like exactly something George R.R. Martin would do. But die Laenor will, because the only other explanation the show can come up with is something related to proximity, where dragon bond gets weaker as a dragon and its rider get further from each other until it is severed. But that'll be an extremely lame explanation for things, especially when you consider that Arya Stark can warg Rhaenyra from all the way across the Narrow Sea. In the books, Arya controls her direwolf, which is active in the Riverlands, when she's training with the Faceless Men in Braavos. The warging power of the Starks is similar to the dragon bond of the Targaryens, though it runs far deeper. Wargs literally one body, one mind, the whole soul bonding situation. And when a warg dies, it's said that they can live a second life in the skin of their bonded animal. The dragon bond probably doesn't run this deep, but it's very similar to the warg bond, which means that distance shouldn't be as much of a factor in its weakening. This should be the only factor, which means, unfortunately, Laenor Velaryon would not be returning to House of the Dragon. It's strangely calming knowing that he's already been mourned by his parents, because his second death doesn't need to be explained. It just needs to have occurred on his terms, because honestly, that would be the perfect ending for his character arc. Seasmoke is going to be claimed by a man we don't know much about yet, but we do know that he can build ships and make a killer goat stew. Or so his brother says. Marvelous verdict. And that's it for this video. Let us know what you guys think in the comments down below, and don't forget to like and share this with your fellow Throneheads. Subscribe to Marvelous Videos for more hot content this dragon season, and we'll see you guys in the next one.